So here's where the last time where we left off. If you've looked online at the slides, they're up there. We talked about state of nature. It's a state of state in which we as people are free and equal, Locke says. Being free means having the ability or the right to decide how you're going to live your life, but not just any old thing. It's not license. Right? Liberty is something that's limited by the rights of others. Now these rights, Locke tells us, are health, life, liberty, and property, or your possessions. Those rights can be enforced in the state of nature because we all also have a natural executive right. So we have life, health, liberty, possessions, and executive right being the right to punish. Now the natural executive right is primarily the thing that causes all the trouble, right? So Locke as well. Of course, there's going to be bad people, but even if people aren't so bad, as soon as something happens, we're going to be over-punishing the people we don't like, under-punishing the people we like. We're going to be not impartial, but partial towards ourselves. So if something happens to us, we're going to be sort of overreacting. And if we do something to someone else, we're going to feel like they overreact towards us. And so we start, so there's a lot of fighting and conflict and difference that happens that way. Now, that's the argument for the state, right? He says, well, we need to leave that behind. And so rational people in a state of nature, they will come together and create a government. How is what we'll be talking about most today. But before that, note two things. One is a point about justification. I'll get to in a second. The other is this point about a moment where Locke does actually seem to be addressing Hobbes. If it's not Hobbes, then it's maybe Filmer or people like them. Anyway, he's addressing the type of view where one might think that because the state of nature is bad, pretty much any government is justified if it's not the state of nature anymore. Right? Remember this from Hobbes, the state of nature is the worst, so it's in your rational self-interest to accept any type of government, obey the law, pretty much come what may, except if they kill you, which is just as bad as the state of nature, and then all bets are off. Locke thinks that's a mistake, so there's an argument here against Hobbes, at least part of Hobbes' view. And he's trying to say, no, Hobbes, you're wrong that the state of nature is the worst, because there's something even worse than the state of nature, which is being in civil society but under an absolute ruler. Just very simply put the argument, right? It's rational to avoid the state of nature, says Locke, but also Hobbes, right? Because of people being judges in their own cases. Locke says, yeah, I agree. Right? This is what causes all these punishment problems. Right? No impartial judges, we're all no indifferent judges. They care, right? We care too much. But he says there's, under an absolute ruler, these problems are just heightened. If the worry about people being judges in their own case is that there is no check upon what they might do, well, here we have an absolute ruler also has no checks upon what they might do. You don't have a say in it. You don't have any appeals. There's not a rule of law, right? You can't go to the Supreme Court and say, Congress passed a law that doesn't fit the Constitution. There is no Constitution. All there is what the absolute ruler says. And so Locke says in these sections, especially 13, but also 90 to 93, he says this is much worse because this is like the state of nature, but with a lot of power concentrated. If you're worried about, pole foxes and cats or something, then you start talking about how we should obey the lion. Right? Lions are more dangerous than whatever a pole fox might be. So, therefore, it's rational to avoid the state of nature. It must be also rational, even more rational to avoid absolute rule. It's even more dangerous, he says. Because in the state of nature, at least you stand a fighting chance. When this absolute ruler comes after you, you're dead. Right? It's guaranteed. So it matters a lot, right? Hobbes thinks that there are no standards to judge the state, no moral standards, because it's rational. There is no morality in the state of nature, and because any state is rationally preferable to the state of nature. But if Locke is right and there are rational limits, then there must be, and because it is, right? Moral limits. So that's a passage that sort of comes and goes. You might think it's obvious, but theoretically, a lot hinges on whether Hobbes is right or Locke is right about this. So keep that in mind. But it's a cute argument anyway. Right? All right. This is what we'll be talking about mostly today. But this is the final slide of what we were supposed to get through last time. So Locke is going to give an account of what it takes to justify the state. It's an argument for consent. Right? Why consent matters. Right? Remember, for Hobbes, it's just rationally better. That's what matters. For Locke, it's going to be, that's not going to be enough. He says, yeah, the state of nature stinks, but not anything is justified. What we need is consent. So here are the steps. Right? Free and equal people get to do what they want, A, within the rights of others, and B, without subordination to others. That's how the second treaty starts, right? Remember? It's a state of freedom and a state of equality. Means you get to decide and you don't have to ask leave or be dependent on the will of others. It's reciprocal freedom as much as anyone else. Now, one person claiming natural authority, as some sort of king claiming a divine right to rule might. Right? One person claiming a natural authority over another, that's without a consent, right? Saying like, I'm appointed by God or whoever, right? That's an attempt to subordinate them. Right? You're saying, actually, you might think that we're naturally free and equal and you get to decide how to live, but you do have to ask leave from me. Like, my will goes. It's more important than yours. When I tell you you don't get to be a farmer, you don't get to be a farmer. Right? If I tell you that if you're going to grow wheat this year, 20% is going in my pocket, right? Then that's my will decides it. You say no, well, you can say all sorts of things is happening. Right? So, all right. So that's an attempt to subordinate, right? Because your will then matters less than mine. So in the state of nature, it follows then, right, that there is no natural authority over others, because that's not possible in the state of nature, says Locke. There are no natural bosses. They can say that, but they're wrong. So if natural authority doesn't exist, then any legitimate authority, the real deal, right? Not just these imposters, these divine right fakers, right? But the real deal, the actual legitimate authority, if there is such a thing, that has to be created freely by their consent. Right? By those who are going to be subject. I put like sections behind it for you to double check if you want to go back over this. And so therefore, people leave the state of nature by freely creating, by their consent, the authority to which they are going to be subject. Right? So legitimate authority is authority that does not violate your natural freedom and equality. And there you go. We'll get back to this in a moment when we switch to the other slides. But that's the job of justifying the state. Right? It's going to reconcile this beginning point here where Locke says, no natural authority, no natural bosses, with a situation in which, guess what? There are bosses. Right? Government claims authority over you. Whenever they pass a law, they're claiming that they get to tell you what to do and what not to do. Right? They get to tell you, they claim that they get to tell you how much of your money you get to keep come April. Right? Or every month, really. Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. In the state of nature, if I were to do it to you, it would be wrong, because I'd be violating your natural freedom and our natural equality. Now we have these people, IRS, people who are running caucuses and stuff, they want to become those people, right? Lots of people love being those type of people, we know that. They want to tell us what to do, and they want to take our stuff and so on, right? Now, maybe they're imposters, like these divine right fake people, right? Maybe not. If not, Locke says, here's one way they can not be a faker, but a real deal, legitimate one, it's consent. That's going to be what we're going to be looking at more. All right, so the job of justifying the state is to make the right of non-subjection, in natural freedom and equality, consistent with being subject. Right? We are subjects. And Locke says you have a right to not be a subject, so you need to fit those two together. And consent is supposed to be the bridge. Right? Consent is what makes that okay. If you've read the piece by Simmons for last time, notice this argument here is the reason why he defines the state of nature as the absence of legitimate authority. State of nature is wherever you still have your natural freedom and equality. So wherever you're not legitimately subject to a common judge or a common political authority. Okay, this is big picture stuff. Are we okay with this so far? Getting a sense how the pieces fit together? Okay. All right. Most of today we're going to dig into this here. So, put some more meat on the bone, right? By definition, the state for Locke is going to be contrary to our natural freedom and equality. Here's how he defines a state, right? There only is political society where every one of the members has quitted this natural power, meaning natural power to live your life as you please and to punish wrongdoers. Those who are united into one body and have a common established law and I can never say that, judicature, to appeal to, with authority to decide the controversies between them and punish the offenders, they are in civil society, one with another. So, you have a bunch of rights and powers in the state of nature. Live as you see fit. Apply the law of nature. Apply morality, right? Protect your rights. Protect other people's rights. Punish the wrongdoers. State of nature. But what the state is the absence of those things. Right? That's the definition of what a state is for him. But, of course, here's the problem. This is just restating what we just saw. But Section 4, the right in the beginning, right, he says, but you have a right that those things don't get taken from you. So you can see there's a conflict between your natural freedom and what the state is. So A and B are just in conflict or in tension. To justify the state, you have to show that this does not violate this. And the answer is consent, of course. A free person can become subjected by freely accepting to be a subject. That's what consent does. So that's why, even though he accepts that it will be crappy in a state of nature, that alone won't do the trick. Right? Your liberty, your natural freedom, your rights stand in the way. All right. So far, so good? Pop quiz, knock the life out of you. Will teach me. All right, so Locke is offering consent is the bridge, right? So you consent, you freely accept the state's authority, and that shows why the state, despite having authority, despite subjecting you, doesn't violate your right to freedom or your right to non-subjection. Right? Now, consent plays, I'm just trying to lay this out clearly. Consent plays a role for Locke in several points in the argument. There's at least 2 and sometimes 3 stages of consent for Locke. You remember right in the beginning of term, we talked about this classroom as if we imagined this classroom was a state of nature. This is like the whole world here. And we're all, like Locke says, naturally equal. And we want to join into civil society, right? We say, this stinks. You're having people fighting with each other and bickering all the time. What we need is one set of rules for all of us. We need one designated authority who we can go to if we're having a problem, and they'll settle it, and then some enforcement and all these things, right? The good stuff that the state is supposed to give us. Now, consent is supposed to make that possible, right? If I just told you, okay, from now on, my will is what goes, right? My will is law. That would violate your natural freedom and equality. Couldn't do that. But if we all consent to make someone, me or someone else or some group of ours, to be in charge, that would be fine. Right? Now, that first time we talked about this, we imagined, my memory serves me, that Justice was the one who didn't want to join. Right? We can make it again. You're the odd man out, right? So I say, so Cameron, you want to be in? Yes, Cameron. Jorge, you want to be in? Yes, 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 no. He says, I can do by myself. If you think about Locke's theory, what would that mean? Like what? Like what's the result?
Never justified in like punishing.
Well, okay. Let's take one step back. Like, do we get the? Is there a society created at all? No. Yeah. Well, no society of all of us, right? Because we need to get his consent. Because we couldn't subject him to our. We couldn't pull him into our society because then, well, his freedom stands in the way, right? Do you want to say something, Brittany?
Wouldn't he be considered irrational for not going to group?
He might be irrational, yeah, depending on. I guess depends on how strong he is, maybe, or like, or if he tends to agree with what we'll end up doing. Yeah. Dominic?
Wouldn't we have a society that just like isn't participating?
Yeah.
So wouldn't we have a society that just isn't participating because we all gave our express consent to like be subjected to the numbers rule to decide? He didn't do that, so he doesn't get to enjoy the rights that we get or the security that we get. If something bad happens, then it's not a problem.
Right.
It's not part of our society.
Right. Yet, right? Right. Yeah, Cameron?
I'll jump off of what Dominique said. We all gave our consent to make a civil society where we can enjoy our special type of freedoms that we get with the civil society. So we're not infringing on his freedom. He has freedom to decide if he still wants to be in the state of nature.
Right, exactly, yeah. So the original suggestion was both right and not right. Anyone who is going to be in society is going to have to consent, right? So within society, you consent, at least in the beginning, the founding one, where we transition from the state of nature to society, unanimity. Everybody has to say yes, 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 right? But doesn't mean that he gets to block our forming a society, right? So we can all form a society, you just need not be a part of it. You're not a member. So like Dominic was saying, he's on his own. We get to have our laws, we get to have our police, we get to have our courts, we get to have, all the things that we want to do together, and then he's by himself. That has good parts and bad parts, right? Doesn't have to pay taxes to us. That's the great part, right? The bad part, of course, is that if he wakes up and suddenly his phone is stolen or his car is broken into or something, right? You can't call the police, right? We can. And of course, that might be a good thing, right? That you can call the police. If he's going to enter into a conflict with one of us, you better hope he's strong enough to throw one of us in jail, right? Yeah. Especially if we as a society judge that actually you're innocent. Because then it might actually come to blows. Right? If we think, yeah, you're right, that person is guilty, then we'll throw him in jail ourselves, or you can do it if you want. Right? But if we disagree, now you have a problem, because you're going to lose. Right? We're much stronger, all of us together. So maybe you'd think one philosopher once called it like you're like a John Wayne, right? You're like just being out by yourself, enforcing justice as you see fit. Okay. Maybe we'll agree upon it. Maybe we'll never get into a conflict at all. It'll be fine. He's not a problem, right? At that point, you're a winner. Unless you maybe want to use some of our, maybe if we have some things like roads and schools and so, you don't get to use those either. But maybe, you're fine with that. You're a winner. But of course, once there is a conflict, you're in trouble. Right? So it's irrational to that extent. So Locke would definitely thinks that it's reasonable for people to join into civil society. That's why everybody joined, he says, in the past. Right? Reasonable people would join, and in the past people had these inconveniences, so they did join. We can stipulate this. It's a reasonable way of reading history. People aren't morons, and if they aren't morons, they're going to understand that civil society is better in the state of nature, and so that's why these social contracts happen in the first place. All right. So, morally speaking, there's two stages. First, like founding consent, the creation of civil society, that has to be unanimous, but unanimous only among those who agree to leave the state of nature. So that would be all of us in this example except justice. The rest remain as free as before. Injure not the freedom of the rest, he says in section 95. So, you be on your own, just don't cause any trouble, we'll be fine, right? You're as free as before. You get to live your life as you please. Now, if we treat him as if he's part of civil society, but he did not give us his consent, then we're violating his natural liberty, right? So we don't get to do that. You say no, no, kicking and screaming, and we say you can live with it, like it or not, then we're wrong. So maybe that's irrational, but you have the right to be stupid sometimes. Okay? In a moment, we're going to get to a distinction between express and tacit consent. Locke says this original founding consent is usually express consent. Doesn't have to be. If you read some of the chapters that I did not assign, you'll see that he says actually sometimes societies can be founded by a scarce and noticeable consent. So tacit consent can be founding consent, but usually it's express. It's an easy way to remember. It's just people coming together, yes, 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 right? Founding the social contract. Here's the second part. Once we have that society, all we've said is we're no longer going to live by our own wills. We're no longer going to punish people as we please, right? That's not a society yet, right? Like that's not a government yet. That's a society, he thinks. We just said, okay, no more everyone for themselves. So then we're going to have to select how this group of ours is going to be governed, but for that we don't need unanimity anymore. For that, majority consent will do. And Locke offers a weird, peculiar, I put here. Well, it's kind of a strange argument here, but it says it's necessary to that which is one body to move one way. So you said we can't have gridlock here. If we're going to be one group, one body, we have to move some way. We can't move all different options or something, or be sitting still. It's necessary that the body should move that way whither the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority, or else it's impossible should act or continue one body or one community. So. Savoy?
I don't know. I just it just becomes problematic, for me, because if it's not unanimous consent, let's say like a small pocket decides to do their own society the way they want it to be governed, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, you can't, right? Because before you became a member of society, you agreed that you would be part of this group, right? And so by agreeing, you're agreeing to be governed by whatever the majority says then. Now, if you don't like that, then stay out, right? That's fine. You can be like Justice. Maybe the two of you can be both John Waynes, you know, or maybe you two want to create your own little society where it's just a smaller one or something. Do whatever you want, right? Just don't bother us. But if you do choose to join, if you're part of this group that unanimously creates civil society, right? And he says you have to accept this because it's necessary, which is somehow I don't get this argument, to be honest with this. That it has to be that if the body is to move one way, it has to move the way that the greater force carries it, which I guess is some like mechanical analogy, like if you're leaning this way, the body is going to go. That happens, yeah. That,
it's like Hobbes mechanical.
Right, right. But then why this weight should be counted in votes? It could be, of course, it could be the law of nature that gives it weight, right?
Or just everyone's morally equal, so it has to go with the greater.
I guess so. Yeah. Well, we give that up, right? Like when we enter society, because we're going to give these governments more of a say than we are. So we're already in civil society here, so we've given up that we're morally equal. Well, I guess this is before this government is appointed, right? So maybe there we still count as equal. Yeah. I guess so. It's interesting. It's clearly not true that it's impossible that it should act if we didn't do it by majority, right? That's clearly not true. Or that it would stop being a body or a community if we stopped doing majority rule. That's also clearly not true.
Probably what's impossible is if unanimity were required on each issue.
Right. Well, it's not. Yeah. Well, you could have it, right?
Yeah.
If you're lucky.
Anyway, yeah.
Right. Right. But in real life, you wouldn't get anywhere, right? And Locke clearly didn't know sort of modern day findings since. Google Kenneth Arrow impossibility theorem, you'll find something that blows this up, really. But basically the idea is that majority will is not the majority will doesn't always represent what Locke thinks is the greater weight. Yeah.
Kind of what Professor McCollum was saying, at the beginning of 86, he says, for when a number of men have by the consent of every individual made a community, he says that if thereby the community is like one body with the power to act as one body, and to make it move, you need a majority. So then he goes on further to explicitly saying you have to have a majority, there's no other way to do it. But I think he starts out by saying, like, if we all are roughly equal, we decide to join this community, we all decide to join one community. The best way to make it move is to do it by movement, because
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, right. So if he was just saying this is a really useful way of doing it, I'm all in. Right? Like, seems right. Right. It seems to be like he's claiming to say that you can do it, but in a majority way. I mean, requiring unanimity on every decision is possible. It's just really impractical, right? Like lots of stuff, especially given that we're trying to get out of a situation of disagreement, right? It's weird to require agreement on everything because we don't have, if we had agreement, we didn't need society in the first place, right? So maybe that's what he's thinking, that it's given that we'll disagree and then unanimity makes it impossible, but still don't know why majority would be necessary. Anyway, this is if you're like me, you can sit on your sofa and think, like, scratch your head reading this for like 20 minutes, thinking, what the hell is he on about? Anyway. Now, notice, as of now, right, he's only talking about selecting how we're going to be governed. So we have unanimity consent of joining society. Everyone want to be part of the group? Yes. Everyone has to say yes. Right? Then, in the group, once the group is formed, the majority of the group gets to decide how the group is going to be run. Right? Now, Locke says that can be done in a bunch of stuff. Right? We can have a parliamentary democracy, which we just say on everything, majority vote wins, or maybe the majority vote of representatives that we appoint wins, or we could just have some type of council that we put in charge. You could put one person in charge. So he says there's a variety of options that you can have. And as long as they stay within the original sort of set deal of the social contract, the original founding of society, this is okay. If you select something like an aristocracy or something, right, some council or whatever, or some group of people who are in charge, then basically majority consent is done with, right? So we've selected that by majority consent, and then they just get to choose. Now, most people think that, and later in the second treatise there are suggestions that Locke thinks that the best one to choose is democracy. And so then we're going to have a lot of majority consent, right? Because then on a daily basis we're going to select laws and rules and so on with the rule of the majority. But that would be a third layer. Right? So first layer is the creation of society, unanimous consent. Second layer is the selecting of the government, or the style of government, some constitution or something. Majority consent. And then we can have majority consent, or we cannot have it on our daily operations. So just keep those separate, because they play different roles. And it's consent, 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 so it can be confusing. All right, any questions? Yeah. Tevin, right?
What if you have like multiple options, so you don't really have it? You have like a plural majority. So that's like say you have 3 options. It's 30%, 33%, 3 groups. And you have 33%, but 67% disagree, or like maybe one has 38%. So
Right.
that's a plural majority. And then you have 62% that disagree with 38%. So I mean, it's majority out of the options, I guess, but it's not really a real majority.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, once you start looking into the mechanics of majority rule, it turns out to be far less simple than it looks at first sight. So, yeah, the arrow thing I was pointing to like in the moment is you can mathematically prove that in a given a certain plausible assumptions, so mathematically always you have to set up your assumptions, right? But that there are no that it's always possible for this kind of problem to happen. The only way you can guarantee that this does not happen is to have a dictatorship. That's what Arrow showed. He won a Nobel Prize for this, so it's pretty, well, and other stuff. But, yeah, that's a pretty big result, right? So the idea that you're having is, well, wait a minute, we could just have these cycling, there's 66% against option A, and then there's another 66% against option B, and then there's another 66% against option C, and so we have no options, right? That can always happen. You can even have cases where if you have two things, so for example, you just need three people. Three people with three questions in front of them. This is a thing that is a finding by legal scholars about how tribunals work. So let's think about like a law case, right? I think, if the person was capable, like mentally capable, and at the crime scene, then they're guilty, let's say. But those are the only things that are in question in the court case. And there's three judges. You could have a majority of the judges believe that he was mentally capable. You could have a majority of the judges believe that he is actually at the crime scene, and a majority who believe he's innocent. And none of them would be making a mistake. Right? You can show that. So, of course, the group is making a mistake, right? Because if both are true, then the third have to be true. But you can have, that's the same example that we are giving, because you can have different two support each. Now you have a problem. What are these tribunals going to do? Because all individuals are being consistent, but the group is inconsistent. Or if the group is going to be consistent, then one of the individuals has to be inconsistent. So neither is a good option. And if you can have that with three, 250 million, you're going to get this all over the place, right? Yeah, so he doesn't deal with this, and democracy turns out maybe not all it's cracked up to be. At least not in that sense. Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's what, if I'm about to address the same thing, but it's like if you have 42% of people voting for option 1, but you have 29 voting for option 2 and option 3, really you got 58% of people voting against option 1. Which one wins out?
Say again?
That's exactly what you're doing. Okay.
Right, okay.
Strike.
Right, well, that's good. Yeah, well, so Locke didn't think about this, or didn't realize that these were possibilities, is my guess. There's ways of finessing it, right? There's ways around this. You can set the agenda in certain ways. So like what you need is you need to have a certain number of people, at least 3 in this case, and a certain number of options, at least 3. So you might set the agenda in a way that there's only 2 options, right? And then once you only have 2 options, there's going to be a majority for or against either, right? If you have to choose, it's the binary choice. The majority is going to fall into place one way or another. So that's one possible. Of course, that begs the question, well, who's setting the agenda, right? If all of us are setting the agenda, the same problem pops up again, because how all of us can, not by unanimity, because we don't agree, right? Not by majority, because now we're cycling again, right? So it's not obvious how you get out of it. So not obvious how this works, but anyway, it's somehow still necessary. So, yeah, but it's a good question. All right, so consent, right? What does founding consent do for Locke? He says it transfers 2 natural powers, 2 powers that we have in the state of nature. So here's a quote. State of nature to emit the liberty we have of innocent delights. I don't know, I guess whistling a tune or something. Maybe eating some fruit or whatever. I don't even know what that is. A man has 2 powers. Just stuff that doesn't really matter, I guess is his point, right? Innocent delights. The first is to do whatever you think is fit for your preservation, right? So eat food, try to acquire some property, protect yourself, these kind of things. And the other one is the power to punish. That's the executive right? So those are the 2 main ones. Both these he gives up when he joins in a private, or if I may call it, or a particular political society, and incorporates into any commonwealth separate from the rest of mankind. Common-wealth. Yeah, so these are the 2 things, right? So what do we consent to? We consent to no longer us making up our own minds about how we're going to protect ourselves, how we're going to try and help, how we're going to live. So we're giving someone else, civil society, who then appoints a government. We're giving them the right to tell us how we get to live, with some limits. And we give them the right to punish criminals. So both of those you lose. If you remember from our discussion towards the end of Hobbes, similar things are appearing here, right? So what we're doing when we give others the power to decide for us what we get to do in pursuit of our self-preservation, we are obligating ourselves to obey them. So civil society appoints a government, Congress. Congress says, no smoking weed, right? In the state of nature, you had that right to decide for yourself. Now, no more, right? You've handed it over. They tell it, you've obligated yourself by your consent, by giving up that power, giving it to someone else. It's a trustee, you put them in charge. They're in charge, they make a decision, now you have to accept it. Right? Now, you might still think, hey, I'm going to do it anyway. Well, you violate the law now, you're a criminal. In the state of nature, I could think, hey, he's committing a crime, I'm going to punish him. No, I don't get to do that, I have to call the police. Right? That's the other power. Support?
So is this again going back to, like, when you join the society, you're understanding that the majority is going to be, I guess, establishing what is a criminal act?
Could be, yeah, or the majority at least is going to appoint someone who decides that. Right? You could appoint an aristocracy or council of wise people or something, right? Yeah. But that's of course why the initial consent has to be unanimous, right? In the state of nature, you could decide this for yourself. No longer if you're in civil society, so you better freely decided to give it up. Or they're just subjecting you, right? Or they're just bossing you around like they don't have a right to. Now, why do you give up those powers? How does Locke know this? Is he just making this up? No, he's not making this up. He has an argument. He says, whosoever therefore out of a state of nature unite into a community. Community always means the same as civil society for him, as far as I can tell. Must be understood to give up all the power necessary to the ends for which they unite in society, to the majority of the community. That's your point, Savoy. This is done by barely agreeing to unite into political society. So barely agreeing to unite means just whatever the most minimal act of founding consent might be, has to include giving up these two powers. Why? Because these two powers are necessary for the society to do its job. Society has a point, just to leave behind the crappy state of nature in which we disagree and we have these problems of fighting and so on. And we solve that by giving these two powers away. Pooling them together as a group, as a community, as a society. Interesting point here, at least I think so. Here you have an argument for why someone like Locke thinks that government, legitimate government, always has limits. Bless you. We'll see it next time that Locke thinks that you can disobey or resist government sometimes. And you can do this when they overstep the boundaries, the limits of their rightful authority. If you remember, he doesn't think any government goes, right? Absolute rule is not good enough because it's worse than a state of nature. Now, why can't, it's impossible for absolute government to be legitimate, he says. Why? Well, because when we consent, what we give up is only that which is necessary for the government to do its job. All the other rights and powers, all your other freedom, you retain. Right? So there's going to be, here's an argument for why there would be limits, and why you have something like a constitution and a Bill of Rights, maybe. Right? You have a right to choose your own religion. Why? Because it's not part of the government doesn't need the right to just decide what religion there is for it to keep the peace. In fact, it's probably a really bad idea, right? If you want to keep the peace, you want the government not to have the right to decide what religion, because if they do have that right, fighting breaks out, historically at least. we give up the right to decide how fast to drive, right? Why? Because we need to keep sort of society safe, and if it's not safe, then there are going to be rights violations, and then people are going to end up fighting. So no, we need to have, so that's part of what government does. Now, does government get to tell you whether you eat your vegetables every day or not? No, right? That's just, I don't know if those are innocent delights, but you keep those right, that right. Does government get to tell you who to marry? Or whether you want to marry at all? No, right? This doesn't, right, so you see an argument here, this is a way for spinning out to thinking about what should be the limits of government. Like, is this part of what joining civil society is about? It's about avoiding the inconveniences, and anything else you retain. Locke is quite clear about that. Okay? All right, here's an argument just to summarize this, what we just saw. So, leaving the state of nature means giving up your natural liberty to do as you please and punish wrongdoers. That's what we just saw. Right? When you give up your natural liberty, you take on an obligation to follow someone else's rules, necessarily. Right? To giving up my freedom to choose, I'm giving it to you. It's not just abandoning it for Locke, referring it to civil society. Now, follow whatever civil society comes up with, a majority of civil society. Now, if you freely agree, say through a promise or consent, to follow someone else's rules, then you become obligated to follow the rules. If you all promise to tell, you say, hey, Boston, I'm going to do whatever you tell me to, then you get an obligation to do whatever I tell you. Or more precisely, as Locke says, if you tell me I will follow whatever I will do whatever you tell me to within the limits of what is necessary for us to have peace here, then you become obligated to obey my orders, as long as I'm telling you to do things that get us peace here, right? If I tell you stop listening to your favorite music, then that's irrelevant. So it's a dud, probably. Right? But if I'm telling you stop fighting, then even though you might want to continue to fight, you got to stop fighting. So what?
So with everything free, I was wondering like what Locke would say to like the forced, like I guess like who was like kidnapped from the outside society and forced them to adopt your society. What would you say to that? Or would that even?
Yeah, it's a good question. We'll see next week. We'll get to Kant, for example, explicitly says you can do that. Right? And if you remember, those of you who've ever read Rousseau, you remember the famous phrase, people are forced to be free in that case. Right? So, because Rousseau thinks you're really free in society, not outside. And so you kidnap them into society, you're forcing them to be free. Rousseau likes paradoxes, let's put it that way. Yeah, for Locke, it's a good question. Does anyone have an idea what Locke would say? So justice wants to stay outside, right? And after a while of us having this society going on, and justice has created some trouble maybe, or maybe not. But we have created trouble for him, whatever. We say, enough of this BS. We're just going to make him, right? Say, here's our tax bill, here are our rules. You get to join our schools, right? You get to call the police. You get to drive on our roads, but no more John Wayning, right? Right. Yeah. Cameron?
Because in the first place, to start the society, we didn't need his consent for us to form consent among ourselves. And by us forcing him into our society, we're getting rid of his natural freedom that he enjoys, whether or not he wants to join or whether or not he wants to be by himself. So you can't kidnap him because then you're robbing him of his agency.
Right. So that's right. I think you're exactly right. Locke would not like this because, as he says, whenever we form our society, that leaves others as free as they were before. However, and we'll get to that in a moment, one of the most controversial parts of Locke is he has an argument for why he thinks in our society, like here in the United States, there can be no one like justice. In the beginning, yeah, but once the stuff is up and running, now you're born here, right? And yeah, so tacit consent is going to be the answer to that. Right? So if you're born here, you don't get to say, well, I don't want to play the game, like I'm going to be on my own. I want to be like John Wayne, literally like John Wayne. Like no, don't, right? That's impossible. So that's going to be puzzling, right? Because you can see how the tension already exists, right? Like, do I have a right to be free or not? Well, you do, but except when you're in society, when you're born into, well, you're always born into society. What is this? So that's a strange view. But he has an interesting argument for it. What did you say?
I said that's all it is, like they're born into.
Right. Right, but Locke is very clear, I'll have quotes, but he says it's very important that you're not a member because you're born into it. And there has to be some other, you have to accept it. He just says whenever, like by being here, you're accepting it, which, anyway, we'll get to this. But yeah, you're pushing exactly on the right spot in the theory, which is the weakest spot. Modern followers of Locke, by the way, just to keep previewing a little more, they agree with you. They say, like, okay, well, what about these people? Like, what if Justice today says, I don't want to play this game anymore. I don't want to be a member of the United States society. Locke says, well, you get to leave. Of course, that's not really, doesn't do much for you, because where do you got to go? Well, some other society, right? Like, if he just wants to be John Wayne by himself, the option isn't there, right? So modern followers of Locke say that arguments from tacit consent is BS anyway. And that's what they say anyway. And Justice does have this initial right to be free, so he gets to be free. That's the quick and dirty version, but that's roughly what they say. Now, of course, if Justice gets to be free, it turns out that probably many, many of us are going to be free. Because when did you ever expressly consent? I didn't. Maybe I tacitly consented by actually immigrating here, but not the best example. Terry didn't. So. Yeah. All right, so if you freely consent to obey the law, then you leave the state of nature. Leaving the state of nature means entering civil society, by definition, right? So if you freely consent to obey the law, then you enter civil society. That's how you put the steps together of what we've been seeing. So here are some quotes, right? Every man, by consenting with others, to make one body politic under government, puts himself under an obligation to every one of that society to submit to the determination of the majority and be concluded by it. Interesting point here, by the way. There's an obligation to obey the law. To who do you owe it? Not to the government, but to your fellow citizens. Because you promised to all of them we're going to be playing the same game here. Again, right? Because we're all free and equal and independent, you cannot be put out of the state and subjected to political power of another without your own consent. That's why Justice gets to stay free, right? Blah, 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 the same point. All right, here's your question, right? What about the natural liberty of you and me, people who weren't at the founding ourselves, right? So political society was founded time immemorial, sometime way, way, way past, right? What about us? And Locke is on board. Locke says, hey, it is true that whatever engagement or promise anyone made for himself, he's under that obligation. So if you consent, you're obligated. But you cannot, by any compact whatsoever, any agreement, promise, consent, contract, whatever you want, right? You cannot bind your children or your posterity. So maybe your parent, your grandparent, your grandparent, maybe they once consented. But that cannot bind you, right? Because your son, when a man, so when you become adult, being altogether as free as the father, you become just as still has his natural freedom because he's an adult human being. Any act of the father can no more give away the liberty of the son than that of anybody else. So nobody's, like I can't give away anyone's freedom except my own. And you can't give, right? It's because we're naturally free and equal. So seems to be a problem, right? So we have these initial founders. They join the civil society. Then they have kids, but what about the kids, right? Seems to be at any moment someone is born, or maybe a foreigner shows up. We have the situation that we imagined in the beginning, which is us in the civil society, and then this John Wayne. And unless he agrees, and of course, the more of these people show up, the more kids are born, the more immigrant, the more dangerous it gets, right? So, yeah. Dynasty?
Dynasty.
Dynasty, sorry.
Can two separate societies be at a state of nature with each other? Like, will they only care about their own separate, like, survival? Does that count as a state of nature if they're like...
For sure, yeah. Great question. Yeah. Hobbes thinks so, Locke thinks so, and it's by definition, right? The definition of the state of nature being the absence of two parties who are not under joint political authority, And as long as there's not a world government, the different countries of our world are going to be in something like a state of nature. Yeah. It'll be slightly different than Hobbes's because the parties aren't roughly equal anymore, right? Like, so the United States is not roughly equally powerful as almost every country in the world. Right? So the dynamics might be a little different, but yeah, morally speaking, state of nature. Right. So here's the problem, right? So authority over time. How can a society over time continue to have authority legitimately? We know how the imposters do it. They use violence, right? And the jerks is to stop it. But the legitimate ones, how is that possible? Because Locke thinks it's possible. Locke thinks something like our society is probably legitimate. Can't be the original founding consent, right? Because that would mean they would sign contracts in my name. Social contracts, big deal, right? And they can't sign a contract in my name because I'm an adult, I'm a free and equal person, and I get to choose for myself. The answer has to do with tacit consent, right? We know this. Does anyone, can anyone explain quickly what Locke means with tacit consent? You have any?
I got an example. I decide I will bring pizza into the classroom.
Right.
And I'm like, hey, everybody, who wants pizza? Then like 6 people like, yeah, I want pizza, I want pizza. And everyone rushes to the pizza box to get some of the cheesy goodness. The people who did not say out loud, I want pizza, but still go to the box to get some of the cheesy goodness, they're tacitly consenting to partake in the cheesy goodness. That's pizza. So that's a tacit consent. Express consent to people like, yeah, give me some of this pizza.
Right.
Tacit consent are like, yeah. They don't say anything. They just partake. Sort of like government.
So good. So there's so it's consent either way, right? It's agreeing. So there's express, that's just like explicitly saying it.
Either
right?
writing it down or verbally saying it.
Exactly, like I promise, or I want to, or yes, or I do, things like that, right? Like marital vows, for example, could express consent. No more other people, right? Yes, I do. Okay, done. But then there's the other type of agreement that's tacit consent, and that's going to be silent, right? Or at least without those words. Sometimes people say it's implied consent. Yeah, so it could be that if it's well understood that you show up at a certain place that counts as agreeing, and you show up at it, then it's. I think I have some examples here. Yeah, sorry. RSVPing is another one, right? Like you say, like, are you going to show up? And you write back, yes, I will, right? Then that's express consent. You're expressly consenting to show up, thereby obligating you. But you can have tacit consent. So ordering food in a restaurant, right? You sit down on the table, you say, I'll have the steak, please, and a bottle of wine. And so you sit down, then the bill shows up. If you say, I never agreed to pay the bill, right? Right? We all know that it's BS, right? You're trying to pull a fast one, because everyone knows sitting down and ordering something in a restaurant, if there's a menu that has prices on it, you're agreeing without saying the words, so tacitly, right? You're agreeing to pay for the food. Raising your hand at an auction, right? $100, bang. You agree to pay whatever the next bid is, right? 105, boom, I'm on the hook. Even if I don't agree to that, I should show up. I'll raise my hand. Right? You can have things like this too in a meeting, right? So I propose that we adjourn for today. Any objections? Nobody says a thing. That means you all agree that we're going to adjourn for today. Right? Things like that. 10 more minutes. So it's clear that this is a real distinction. Right? These are two different ways in which we can agree to things. Explicitly, by saying it or using the words, or implicitly or tacitly, by not saying, but by doing things that count, are as good as explicitly agreeing. So far, so good? Now, Locke's point is, people like you and me, we're born in society. We don't expressly consent. So that's not going to be, or we might, right? In his day, it was common that whenever there was some sort of strife about who was the legitimate ruler, that the king would ask for people to come and give a vow, right? They had to actually kneel and then say, I vow to obey you, and not the other guy. Right? So you can do express consenting. People who move into the country and who become nationalized citizens, they expressly consent. Right? They say, They held up their hands, say, I will obey the law, I promise. One of the reasons I'm not sure I want to be naturalized. Seems a serious obligation to take on. Right, so that's expressly consent. It happens in our lives. The president, right, when they get sworn in, expressly consent. I will uphold the Constitution and all that. So that's. But most of us, you, me, right, we haven't. No explicit consent. But we've done tacit consent, says Locke. And how do you give tacit consent? Well, by being here. That's a weird thing to say, maybe. You think just being here is as good, right? You live here, it's like showing up in the restaurant and ordering food. So by just being here within the land of the government, I'm here, I'm saying, thereby, implicitly, tacitly, yeah, I agree, I accept. I promise to obey all the laws. Right?
What it has something to do with utilizing public goods as well? Because if you're going to, A, be there, and then B, utilize the stuff that this government that they're giving you, isn't that be kind of like ordering food from a menu? Like, if I'm taking the good stuff, and I have to accept that, like, I don't have to agree with everything, but I'm going to take what I want to agree with, and I'm going to have to take something that I don't necessarily agree with as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. There are different versions of trying to get at the same intuition, right? So one way is to say, what Locke is saying is, you don't even have to take things, but just by being here, that's enough. And being here, and so even stronger for the things like you're saying, when you use public goods, that implicit in doing that, you're accepting. Not just to pay for it, but to obey all the laws, right?
If you want to do that forever and just like go out to the woods, and I mean that's like a little easier to do that. Well, he's here, but he's like not utilizing anything we open to him, so he doesn't want anything to do with it. So that's one thing. But I don't think it's being everything, but it's utilizing what they're willing to do.
Right. Yeah, the issue, if you want to get philosophical about it, right? The issue is going to be if the argument that you're trying to get at here has to do much with consent, right? So for Locke is saying, by being here and using these things, that is the same as agreeing, morally speaking. Now, maybe that's true, maybe not, but if it's not true, there might be other reasons why you think that using it would still be like accepting. So you might think, for example, that there's something unfair about taking benefits that are produced by people obeying the law, and then you not obeying the law. Right? So, but that's a fairness argument. You say, well, it's unfair, not because you agreed, but because it would be unfair for you to obey. So, you think it's more like consent?
Yeah, if you take what they're willing to give you, it's kind of like, you got to understand that what you're taking has to be attached to it as well.
Right.
But if somebody's saying you have to utilize public goods, like, once you start doing that.
Yeah, so there's some weird things here, right? Like, for example, if I stand here and I walk on the roads, which is a public good, and I say very loudly, I am not accepting the obligation to obey the law, right? I am not accepting. No, you might think it is, but no, right? So the whole day. So it's hard to say that implicitly I'm still giving my consent, because I'm very explicitly not giving my consent, right? So if you think there's still something, like I can't get off the hook like that, then maybe there's something else going on than my consent, right? Right. That's not to say that it's not a good idea. There are a number of philosophers have tried a variety of different arguments to try and get at that idea. A lot of people think that you're onto something. But the question is the thing we're onto consent or something else? Right? That's the philosophical problem. Tyler?
I just brought to mind that the people who carry around a card or like when they're approached by a law officer being like, oh, I'm not legally a citizen, I'm not I'm my own sovereign, and so it's
They exist?
And it's like, and then the cop's just like, well, that's whatever, but you're driving on a road, so I'm going to give you a ticket. So
Right.
Similar situation. Clearly doesn't fly.
Right, yeah. Yeah, they don't accept this argument, obviously, right? But
And there's some benefits you can't avoid, like the police providing safety or the military preventing invasions. There's nothing you actively do to get that benefit, you just can't avoid it. And you might intuitively think you still have to pay your share, and that would be where it would be fair play rather than consent.
right. Yeah, public goods by most definitions are necessarily goods that you can't avoid consuming, right? It's like, for example, clean air. So people pay money to keep the air clean, let's say, or the water clean, and then you're breathing because you got to breathe, right?
Yeah, but if you're in your most typical civil societies, there are public goods that you can't avoid, avoid,
Right.
but there are, there's a good amount that you can avoid, but you
Right.
really
Right.
take advantage of.
Right.
That's when you get into the free riders dilemma.
Yes, so fairness arguments are usually designed to try and justify forcing free riders to be paying riders, right? And no longer free riders. That's what they're for. Yeah. Whether they work or not is notorious. If you, Nozick actually has a famous couple of pages in which he, by some accounts, including mine, thrashes these type of arguments. But that's to take a stand on it. They have, I think a minority of political philosophers now thinks that the fairness argument works, at least in the way that people would want to use it to get the state justified. But a good number of them believe this, so that's not a. It's not some sort of unsavory view, or yeah, it's a respectable view. All right, here's the argument, right? So, common distinction between express and tacit consent, which are concern our present case. Nobody doubts that express consent will make you a member. The difficulty is what we should look upon as tacit consent and how far it binds. So, how far one shall be looked upon to have consented and thereby submitted to any government where he has made no expressions of it at all. Right? This is a puzzling thing. You don't say anything, you don't do anything, you just get born, you go about your business, consent. Right? And to this I say, every man that has any possessions or enjoyment or any part of dominions of any government does thereby give his tacit consent and is as far forth obliged to obedience to the laws of that government during such enjoyment as anyone else. Right? Whether this is possessions be of the land to him or his heirs forever, or a lodging only for a week, so a tourist, right? Or whether it's just barely traveling the highway, right? You're just sort of passing through, I don't know. In Holland you could pass through. America it's a little harder. And in effect it reaches them as far as the being just within the territories of the government. Just being here is enough. Right? Locke has an argument for why this would count as tacit consent, right? He's just asserting it. It's not an argument yet. Two quick things before we end. One, so Locke has an argument for this. Notice that he needs an argument, right? He has an argument, he needs an argument because in the state of nature, right, before we create the government, you and I, and therefore everybody, we don't have that right, right? I don't get to tell you in a state of nature, hey, you're in this classroom, which, by the way, is my classroom, right? So I'm the boss, right? And, if you don't like it, you go somewhere else. Because that's what he says, but tacit consent, right? As long as you're here, you're bound. Now, if you leave to Canada or something, then you're no longer bound. But if you come back, you're bound again, right? So, but I don't get to do that to you in a state of nature, right? So something needs to happen when we move from state of nature to civil society to give the government or civil society that right to do that. Right? In the beginning, all of us consented, and justice was free to be by himself. Right? Fast forward a couple of centuries, right? Justice is born, he's no longer free. Right? Like what happened? Didn't happen in the beginning. So something must have happened in the meantime, or at least something happened when we set up the civil society, such that justice couldn't just be by himself anymore. So that's one. That's why we need this type of argument. We'll get to that next time. Second is just so you know, and I've said it a couple of times already, but this is by far the most controversial part of Locke's theory. Locke has an argument for why this might be true. It'd be true that by just being here, you tacitly, implicitly consent, you give your agreement. But we'll see David Hume famously had an objection to it, and most philosophers nowadays think is decisive. So we're going to go through it to see how it goes, because it is an interesting argument, but be warned, you might not want to hang your hat on it. It's up to you, of course. Maybe Hume was wrong, but it's kind of notorious in that sense. All right, one more minute. Anyone, any questions? Any objections? Hope to see you in about an hour for the talk by Altman. That's School of Education 224. And whether or not you're there, see you on Tuesday.